The cup rests on the table. The steam rises slowly. Almost nothing happens. Fingers envelop the warmth without realizing when it began. There's a moment when the body is already there before the mind arrives. A simple gesture, repeated so many times it's gone unnoticed. The weight of the object, the temperature passing through the skin, the silence between one movement and another. The world continues to make small, invisible adjustments. Nothing breaks. Nothing stands out. The clock ticks without a sound loud enough to be heard. The light shifts on the wall. Air enters, exits, enters again. There's a weariness that doesn't come from the body, but spreads through it. A gentle, constant exhaustion, like a background that never fades. Even when everything seems in order, it passes by mind. It doesn't walk. Raisin. Thoughts glide by like images seen from inside a train. No one knows when they began, nor where they are going. They simply follow, one after another. Sometimes fast, sometimes heavy, always occupying the space where something could rest. There's a silent attempt to keep things in place. Small efforts to preserve what was once familiar. Routines, names, roles, old versions of oneself that are still carried as if they still fit, as if time had taken a discreet pause, waiting for everything to be resolved before moving on. But the body feels before it understands, always hears. A tension in the shoulders, a slight tightness in the chest, a gaze that takes a while to focus. None of this screams. It simply remains, like a low noise that becomes normal as the days go by. There is movement everywhere, but inside something seems out of sync, as if a part of it is always one step behind, trying to reach a moment that no longer exists. The day fills with tasks, things to do, things to resolve, and in the midst of it all, a feeling that's hard to name. It's not clear sadness. It's not obvious pain. It's more like a continuous struggle to make sense of something that slips through your fingers whenever you try to hold on to it. The present is happening too fast, or perhaps too slowly. People change their tone of voice. Places don't respond as they once did. What once offered support now seems distant. Even so, there's an insistence on maintaining appearances, on sustaining the idea of stability, on pretending that everything remains the same enough that it doesn't need to be confronted. Silence appears in the intervals, between one thought and another, between one step and another, but it is rarely noticed. It appears and disappears without being recognized, like a door that opens for a second in a constantly moving corridor. Something there invites a pause, but the impulse to move on is faster. There is a scattered attention spread across yesterday and tomorrow. The present is too small to contain so many expectations, yet it is in the present that the body remains. It is in the present that breathing persists. It is in the present that the world touches the skin, even when the mind is distant. Nothing seems wrong enough to justify stopping. Nothing seems certain enough to bring rest. And so, almost imperceptibly, a subtle distance is created between what happens and what is experienced, as if life were in continuous motion, while something observes from the outside, trying to reach, trying to understand, trying to hold on. The steam from the cup is no longer there. The heat subsided. The moment passed without warning, and something, very quietly, begins to be noticed. His gaze returns to the table. Nothing was said, but something shifted. There are times when a small internal decision alters the weight of the day, not as a grand gesture, but as an almost imperceptible adjustment, a tilt, a shift in attention, something that doesn't require force, just enough presence not to ignore what was already there. Change doesn't begin in the world. It begins in the space where the world is perceived, and sometimes that space calls for a sign, not a scream, a simple gesture, a word left in the comments, not as an automatic reply, but as a mark of awareness, a silent record that something has been touched, writing not to convince, but to acknowledge, to allow the inner movement to take shape, however briefly. There is value in that, more than it seems. When a thought is expressed, it ceases to circulate on its own. It takes shape, it breathes, and as it breathes, it begins to transform. Small, real, possible, This is how change infiltrates, not by force, but by the conscious repetition of small acts. Liking isn't just about clicking a button. It's a silent agreement, a sign that this space matters enough to continue existing, that this pause amidst the constant noise deserves to be preserved. The inscription is not a commitment to future promises, but to the willingness to return, to sit again, to observe once more. Nothing here requires haste, nothing requires certainty, just enough presence to acknowledge that things can be different, that it's not necessary to continue at the same pace, that it's possible to adjust the pace, and that this adjustment begins now, in this exact interval between one thought and another. The movement is already underway, even though it doesn't have a name yet. And while all this is being organized internally, the next silence approaches. The movement continues, even when it is not accompanied. There is a subtle difference between following and being led, between going with the flow and resisting it without realizing it. Attachment doesn't announce itself. It settles in slowly. It begins as a memory. Then it becomes a reference. At some point, it becomes identity. The mind returns to old versions of itself, like someone visiting a house that no longer exists but insists on recognizing every wall, every sound, every sensation. There is comfort in that. There is security, even if that security is based on something that no longer responds in the same way. The body is here, but something remained. It got stuck in a conversation that ended differently than expected, at a time when things seemed simpler, in a phase where there was clarity, or at least the feeling that there was. The mind learns these shortcuts and starts using them as a refuge, whenever the present demands more attention than one is willing to offer. None of this is noisy. Nothing seems wrong. Attachment often disguises itself as loyalty, to those who are gone, to what once worked, to the image that was built with so much effort. There is constant work involved in keeping these structures standing, even when the ground has shifted, even when the weight is no longer the same, even when something inside needs space to move. There are people who remain deeply involved long after they have gone their separate ways. There are words that still echo, even when silence has taken over the place where they were spoken. There are expectations that remain active, even without a destination to return to. The mind lives in the past. The present moment passes us by, and the more one tries to hold on, the more evident the effort becomes. Like hands clenched too tightly, like held breath, like attention stuck on something that can no longer be adjusted. The flow of life doesn't demand a decision. It simply happens. And yet, there is a constant attempt to negotiate with it. Holding back the river seems possible for a few seconds, until the water escapes. It slips through our fingers. It slips to the side. It slips from within. And in this process, something gets tired. A tiredness that doesn't come from doing, but from resisting, from the continuous effort to keep what is already in motion, to prevent change from traversing the inner space. It is not time that abandons. It is the attention that is fixed. It fixates on how things were, on how they should have been, on how things could have continued if something had been different. The mind constructs silent narratives and comes to inhabit them. The present becomes merely a backdrop, something to be traversed while the focus remains elsewhere. This affects perception. It affects the rhythm. Opportunities pass by unnoticed. Relationships transform without being observed. The body continues breathing, following routines, keeping to schedules. But something inside observes from afar, as if always a little behind. In life itself, there is suffering in that, even if he is not named. It's not intense enough to get attention. It's not clear enough to ask for help, but it's constant enough to take up space. A low noise, a feeling of disarray, like trying to dance to a song that's already changed time signature. Those who cling to the past cannot keep up with the flow of life, not by mistake, but it was due to distraction, because looking back requires less presence than sustaining the present. The present is alive. It moves. It offers no guarantees. The past, on the other hand, is already defined. It can be revisited without surprises. Even if it hurts, it doesn't change. And perhaps that is why the mind returns. To avoid the risk. The risk of being fully present here, of realizing that nothing remains the way it was, of feeling that identity is also movement, that what seemed solid was only a temporary agreement with the moment. There's a silent tension when this starts to become apparent. Nothing has been resolved yet. It's simply noticeable. Like someone who realizes they've been swimming against the current for longer than they thought. Like someone who feels the weight in their arms without remembering when they started carrying it. And at this point, something demands attention, not as an immediate answer, but as an opening. If this resonated with you in any way, leave a comment at the end of this video, not as an obligation, but as a conscious gesture. It can be a simple word, like attachment, flow, or presence, or a short phrase, something that represents where your mind usually goes when your body is already here. Writing this in the comments is a way to bring to the surface what usually remains silent. If this space makes sense, a like helps keep it alive. And subscribing is just an invitation to continue this observation together, at whatever pace is possible. No rush, no promises. Why is the question starting to take shape now? When everything slips away, what are you still trying to hold on to? There is an almost imperceptible moment when the body stops resisting even before the mind agrees. It's not surrender, it's an adjustment. Something loosens inside, like when the shoulders slump without warning, like when breathing finds space on its own, after being held for a long time. It doesn't happen because it was decided. It happens because bearing it has become too heavy. And within that weight, a silent intelligence emerges that doesn't ask permission to act. Flowing doesn't mean giving up. Giving up makes a noise. Flowing is silent. There's an old idea that following the flow of life is a sign of weakness, as if constant tension were necessary to exist with dignity, as if relaxing the struggle meant losing something essential. But the body knows. It always has. Water doesn't push the river. It trusts the path that opens up as it moves. Being present requires no effort. It requires the absence of escape. The present moment doesn't need to be conquered. It's already happening. What's tiring is trying to be somewhere else while you're here. What's exhausting is the internal conflict between accepting what is and insisting on what should be. Flowing means stopping dividing energy between these two sides. Letting go is not losing. It's about creating internal space. Space to understand better. Space to feel without immediately interpreting. Space to respond instead of reacting. When something is released, it doesn't disappear. It simply ceases to occupy the center, and that changes everything. Attention reorganizes itself. Perception expands. The present ceases to be a threat and begins to be a field. None of this happens in a dramatic way. The liberation is discreet. It doesn't arrive as a definitive answer, but as momentary relief, an interval, a breath, a second in which the mind doesn't race to explain, it simply observes. In that second, something aligns, not because it was understood, but because it ceased to be fought against. The change does not require authorization. It's already underway. Control has always been partial. The attempt to control everything creates a false sense of security, but it comes at a high price: anxiety, rigidity, emotional exhaustion. When this begins to be perceived, a silent question arises, not verbalized, but felt, about how much effort it still makes sense to maintain. Relating to change is different from resisting it. Relating to others requires awareness. It's about observing what is changing without immediately trying to fix it. It's about allowing discomfort to exist without turning it into a problem. It's about understanding on the most practical and psychological level that fighting the inevitable consumes energy that could be used to live more clearly. Flow is not the absence of pain. It is the absence of internal war. Pain can pass. It can linger. Flow doesn't guarantee comfort. It guarantees movement. And movement prevents accumulation. Emotions flow. Thoughts arise and dissolve. Mental states change. When they are not held back, they don't take root too deeply. There's a lightness to it, even when it's serious. A mature, conscious lightness that doesn't deny the complexity of the human experience. It simply avoids adding unnecessary weight. The effort of being someone you're no longer. The effort of sustaining narratives that have lost their meaning. the effort of remaining the same in a world that transforms with every breath. When the fighting ceases, something else begins to take center stage, not as a promise, as an experiment. The flow doesn't push, it carries when there is availability. And this availability doesn't arise from passivity, but from mindfulness, from the honest recognition of what is happening now, without embellishment, without excessive explanations, just presence. At this point, silence takes on a different quality. It ceases to be empty. It becomes fertile ground, a field where perception deepens, where small things gain clarity, the distant sound, the sensation of the seated body, the internal rhythm slowing down without being forced. All of this communicates something that words cannot reach. Wisdom doesn't shout. She reveals herself little by little. And perhaps that's what's beginning to be seen here. Not a final solution, not a closed teaching, but a change in perspective. A subtle shift from rigidity to flexibility, from resistance to listening, from control to a conscious relationship with what moves. When you stop fighting the flow, something changes in the direction of the movement. Not because the world adjusted, but that's because the relationship with him changed. And this perception is not yet closed. It remains open, breathing, deepening in its own silence, as if something essential were about to be recognized, but still needed space to emerge. If this moment resonated with you, please leave a comment below. It could be a word like flow, presence, or let go, or a short phrase, something that represents what you feel you need to stop fighting for right now. Sharing this helps bring to consciousness what often remains only in the internal space. If this content sustains your attention, a like keeps that flow alive. And subscribing is an invitation to continue this journey of self-discovery, conscious mental health, and presence without haste, at the pace of what is still unfolding, because the observation didn't end here.